I'm continuing my look at DeepMind's study evaluating various chess variants, and in this video I want to look at no castling chess. Well, there are certain advantages to this particular variation. With this rule change, most modern chess theory is completely invalidated if the kings can't castle. It's also a very easy rule change to understand and implement. The kings simply can't castle. I'm also particularly interested in this variation because, well, as many of you will know, I had a book published earlier in the year on Sultan Khan, who grew up in India and learned the Indian form of chess, where there was no castling and pawns were only allowed to move one square forward. So it's sort of similar to the game that he would have played. And he only learnt Western chess much later on, actually in his adulthood, and had just 3 years of playing Western chess before he came to Europe. And well, in 1929, he promptly won the British Chess Championship, an extraordinary performance. But it was quite clear that looking at his games, they were strongly influenced by his background playing Indian chess, where you couldn't castle. And he often found his king in some jeopardy. He wasn't really used to castling early and didn't certainly in his early years in Europe, didn't really get when he should be castling and when he shouldn't. So anyway, let's look at some chess. So what I want to do actually is look at a game between two humans, Vladimir Kramnik and Boris Gelfand, who tried out no casting chess. But before then, I want to show you a couple of examples of AlphaZero's play against itself. So here's one particular game that shows you, well, supposedly, I don't know about best play, but certainly really strong play if we have AlphaZero playing against itself. So in this game, well, it looks like a pretty regular start. B3, so it looks like a sort of Collar-Zukertort variation. And here AlphaZero played H5. So the classic AlphaZero move in classical chess sometimes. But in no castling chess, this is often played simply with the idea of bringing the rook into the game at an early stage, sometimes via h6, sometimes by advancing that h-pawn. And this game continued pawn takes pawn, bishop takes, bishop b2, and now king f8. And this is also a very, very common move in AlphaZero's games playing no castling chess. The king just tucks itself away, and then the game continues. And well, let's just continue this game a little further. c4, and now h4, and I find that quite an extraordinary move because it does potentially give black the option to use that g4 square later. But as I said, AlphaZero likes these rook's pawns moves, particularly in no castling chess. Okay, let me just show you another quick example of AlphaZero playing no castling chess in the opening. So in this one, it plays a Tarrasch. There we go, c5. Pawn takes pawn. It looks like completely normal opening theory up to a certain point. Remember, they can't castle. So a solid start from both players. And now a move which looks very odd to me, h6. I mean, one thing is it prevents the bishop coming to g5. But there's another reason for taking out or controlling the g5 square. And now h4 from AlphaZero. So this move again, and I mean, I find this one quite extraordinary because again, it could possibly give black access to that g4 square with either the bishop or the knight. Bishop e6, now we can see the reason behind h6, not just preventing bishop g5, but preventing knight g5 as well, hitting that bishop. So basically, it looks as though AlphaZero is sort of buttressing, supporting that pawn on d5 very solidly. And here, king f1 played. So again, this move, just tucking the king out of the way, and then the game continues. Interesting stuff. Anyway, I want to show you a game played between two humans. So we have Boris Gelfand and Vladimir Kramnik playing a blitz game with no castling chess, and this was included in the DeepMind study. And yeah, it's all very well evaluating these different chess variants using AlphaZero, this incredibly powerful chess machine. But I think the true test of these variants comes when humans play, actually. So let's see how they played. It looks as though both have thought about no castling beforehand, and they have modified their opening play. So we have f4 from Gelfand, and this can be a useful move in this form of chess, because it may well enable the king to kind of self-castle, and then g3 or e3 and bishop g2, move the rook to the middle, and then the king, well, it castles manually. And that's roughly what Gelfand tried to do in the game. Well, he used e3. And now Kramnik played h5. And he's following AlphaZero's way, and trying to get this rook into the game. If you can't castle, then this rook can't come into the middle very easily, so it finds play potentially on the h file. And it can be a useful move, h5. So for example, if white now, I think, carelessly played e4, then d5 would be a good move. After e5, then you get a sort of favourable French position. And if pawn takes pawn, well, knight f6, and it's not clear what that pawn is doing on f4. So h5 played, knight f3 from Gelfand. e6, e3, knight f6, b3, b6. So both sides just making a queenside fianchetto. And now bishop d3. And h4. So Kramnik plays consistently, advancing that h-pawn, and it could be quite attractive to put that pawn on h3, particularly when you have that bishop. It's just steaming down that diagonal. Very nice. So Gelfand played h3, and already it looks as though Kramnik's play has paid dividends, because he can play knight h5. The pawn is protected by the queen, and that knight can potentially hop into that weakened g3 square. Gelfand played king f2. So he's looking to tuck the king on g1. And here, actually, Kramnik could have played quite an embarrassing move for white, and that's bishop c5. Threatening knight takes f4, exploiting that pin. Yeah, not an easy move to meet, actually. Instead he went bishop e7, which is also fine, and I still like black's position here. And bishop f6. Good move, exchanging this off. And here Kramnik recaptured with the queen, which is fine, but pawn takes looks like a very attractive move, because that pawn clump could well give the king excellent protection, could just sit on e7. That g-file could be used. That pawn on f6 covers two key squares there. And yeah, I rather like black's position there. Queen takes was played, which is also okay. And knight g3. And now king g1. So the king has shuffled back into the corner, so a manual castling. And now Kramnik has to think, what does he do with his king? He can't castle, so where is that king going to live that's safe? He said afterwards perhaps he should have played king e7 here. He went d6 to give the knight a square on d7, which also looks very reasonable to me. Knight g5, knight d7, knight e4. So Gelfand, quite understandably, is exchanging off that knight on g3. Knight takes knight, bishop takes, bishop, knight takes, attacking the queen, queen g6, and the knight came to g5. So, well, after I think a slightly dubious start from Gelfand, actually he's come right back into the game. His king looks pretty safe on g1. It's enabled him to connect his major pieces on the back rank. And now Kramnik has to decide what to do with the king. He played king e7. But with the rook on e1, the king doesn't look that secure. e4, played by Gelfand, an attractive move. e5, so wanting to cement some space in the centre. And now we get a position which is really very similar to King's Gambit positions. d4 and e takes f4. So Gelfand prepared to give up the f-pawn, and why not? Because Black's king is still in the centre. And the knight is now attacked, so came back to f3. It really is a King's Gambit position. Very interesting. And so the king looks a bit shaky in the middle. King f8. Well, this is where the king is going to have the most protection. Behind these pawns, the queen is also there as well. Queen d2 attacking the pawn. Queen g3 defends it. And, yeah, potentially a menacing position. Rook e2, preparing to swing the queen's rook over. I think White certainly has sufficient compensation for the pawn here. Rook h6. So that rook does come into the game via the rook's file. Rook f1. If White can actually take that pawn, then things are pretty good. Rook e6. Right, so this is how Kramnik is going to connect the rooks. Very, very important, as we know on PowerPlayChess. And here, this is actually quite an important moment in the game where White has to think how to recover that pawn on f4. If that pawn drops, then it's clear that White is going to have good play on the f-file and can maybe get through to that pawn. There's a couple of decent moves here. Knight e1 is reasonable. The move I really like actually is d5, which looks a bit odd to potentially give away that square. But watch what happens. If you're going to get something, you've got to give something. So rook g6, knight d4, that's the point. d5 actually gives that nice square for the knight, which can then hop into f5. And we're also looking at this pawn here. And that's actually quite dangerous for Black. So, for example, queen h3, rook f4, knight e5, knight f5. So this h-pawn is vulnerable. Now, in fact, with precise play here, Black can equalize, and after this, well, the queen moves back, White takes here, it's actually an equal position. But I think, d5 would certainly put Black under pressure. But instead, Gelfand played knight h2. And things start to go a little bit wrong now. Rook e8. Nice coordination. Rook takes f4. Knight f6. So Black is actually very nicely coordinated here. Attacking that pawn. So Gelfand has to advance. e5. Pawn takes pawn. Rook f3, the queen went back to g6, and, well, it's clear that Black is winning a pawn here, and it just goes from bad to worse. D5. C4, I guess Gelfand is perhaps pinning his hopes on this queenside pawn majority here, but, well, this looks like many Sveshnikov Sicilians or Najdorfs as well, where the black kingside pawn majority is actually decisive, and black's pieces are so well coordinated, and Kramnik now made no mistake. King g8, finally that king is tucked away and is completely safe. Knight f4, the knight leaps in. e3. Rook takes e3, rook takes, and now black is winning material with queen e4, pin and win. Beautifully coordinated pieces, and in the end a convincing victory for Kramnik. But no, it was an interesting game, and I do like the fact that both players modified their opening strategy on move one, thinking about what are they going to do with their kings. Well, as Kramnik said in the report, in the DeepMind paper, in the report, he said his summary of no castling chess went like this. No castling chess is a potentially exciting variant, given that king safety is often compromised for both players, allowing for simultaneous attacking and counterattacking, and the equality, when reached, tends to be dynamic in nature rather than dry. The multitude of approaches to evacuate the king and their timing adds complexity to the opening play. Well, I think that was really well illustrated by this game. So, another one to try out. I'll be looking at another variant soon, but yeah, I do find this one particularly interesting given my interest in Sultan Khan's play. Thanks for watching.